Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan Jeyarajah and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan Jeyarajah, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We're glad to have you with us, and we're reaching the final weeks of the regular season. We're going to take a look at week 12 and how the teams on our Survivor Island did as we try to figure out who stays and who goes. And then we're going to take a look, it's been a while, so we're going to actually take a look at who seems like they even actually realistically have a chance of winning the national championship. We'll talk about what that's all about, what might go into it, especially in the 12-team playoff. But before we dive into any of this, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of this show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. So how are you doing, Shehan? Welcome to week 13, but we're going to look back at week 12. Welcome to week 13.
Yeah, look, this is the time of year where it starts to really you start to drag a little bit. I'll be honest. It was kind of nice that this past week, outside of Georgia, Tennessee, wasn't too consequential. Like, you could kind of just enjoy it for what it was. But now I think that we start getting into the real home stretch of things. And by the way, the biggest piece of that is going to be tiebreakers, because we are about to see some absolutely deranged stuff from the tiebreakers. I know that I think it was Max Olson from The Athletic pointed out that in the Big 12, technically it's possible that we end up in a 6-way tie with 6-3 records, where by the way, just going to point this out, if that happened, the two teams that make the conference championship game would be Kansas State and Baylor. How about that? That's not going to happen, to be clear. But, in the SEC, it's going to be really consequential because there's so many teams, because of the stupid 8-game SEC schedule, that are going to finish tied at 6-2. So, we are about to end up in a world of chaos. That doesn't even count what's happening in the ACC, where right now it looks okay. Same with the Big Ten. But, that could change in an instant. And even when we get into the latter half of the season, we do have to remember, we'll obviously get the playoff rankings on Tuesday night. For the group of 5 team to make the field, they have to win their conference. And that's a huge assumption right now, that Boise State will just win their conference, that Army or Tulane will just win their conference. But it's a huge difference, and that's something that could change dramatically in the last few weeks. One other thing I want to quickly mention is that after this weekend, all 4 teams that have the mascot, the Owls, have now fired their coach. I don't know what's going on there. I think that's something that we need to look into.
I know you and I have talked about this a little bit because, first of all, credit to the person who pointed out that that's a parliament of owls when you have that many.
Yeah,
I thought it was Owlmageddon, but pointing out it's a parliament of owls, I love that. So I'm not sure who we're going to get, if we're going to get Parliament, George Clinton, all that stuff. There's lots of references to be made, maybe. I think they should straight up go and pull a reverse Ted Lasso, maybe hire someone from British Parliament to come over and try their hand at coaching. But yeah, it's something else. Tom Herman, I felt bad for him just a little bit because he had already said he was clearing house, and they're like, all right, but you should go with them, was kind of the
let's clear the whole house.
Yeah. It's he tried to,
yeah.
I was like, usually when a coach pulls that one, it's like, okay, there was some internal discussion and they're going to let him have one last go at it next season. It's like, nope. Apparently they were just ready to push him out. He just sped it all along, but my goodness.
And that one is one that I am just, because by the way, the 4 teams are Rice, who fired Mike Bloomgren, who had been there, 7 years? He got, I love Mike Bloomgren. He got his fair chance. I think that he would recognize that. Kennesaw State, a little bit of a weird situation, firing Brian Bohannon after 1 year of transitioning. He was a very successful coach. He's actually the only one that the program has had since they established their program back in 2015. FAU, of course, with Tom Herman, like we mentioned, and Temple also over the weekend fired Stan Drayton after 3 years. I was surprised just how badly the FAU thing went. I felt like that was something that was going to work, but I do feel like maybe I mean, we saw FAU be good with Lane Kiffin. Maybe I'm underrating Lane Kiffin as a head coach. Maybe he's incredible because really nobody else has found any success at FAU for the last 15 years or so. So I don't know. Good
I
luck to
remember when
all of them.
Howard Schnellenberger got into a bowl because he built the program up. That was like a miracle. And I love the fact when he got Gatorade, he looked like a wet cat that was very, very upset. There's a great photo of him. But FAU is, I think, a harder job than people realize, although they have invested a fair amount of money in that program and an on-campus stadium and all that stuff a little while ago. So, yeah, but you're right. I mean, Kiffin was the guy who seemed to get it going. And turns out it's a little bit harder than it looks. But again, Tom Herman, I was surprised too, because it seemed like, okay, he was good at Houston when, Houston was still a G5. Maybe he can do the same thing there. And clearly, I guess not, at least not soon enough for the folks in Boca Raton. But we should probably also maybe head over to the folks who are contending here. One last thing about the Big 12, though. I'm crushed that my West Virginia Mountaineers did not make it through. They lost this weekend. So their complete wild card, shot in the dark, moonshot, however you want to put it, chance at winning the Big 12 is out the window. You could probably also say farewell to our friends at LSU, Mizzou, and probably Louisville as well. But all of that said, we're going to look at our Survivor Island. For those of you who may not be familiar, we have a maximum of 12 teams on our Survivor Island. We have to vote off one team, at least one team, each week. Sometimes it's a little more complicated when they all win, but this week we have a couple to choose from already who have lost. We get to be an opportunity to be a little more reactionary. Maybe you might not want to remove all of the teams, but we have to remove one. And if we vote a team off, we get a chance to decide whether we're going to put someone in their place. We don't have to, except for two reasons. With the 12-team playoff, we know that there's going to be 5 conference champs. So if we vote off any of the P4, all of the P4, I should say, of a particular conference, we have to replace them with at least one member because we're going to assume for now that there's going to be a member of the SEC, of the Big 10, of the Big 12, and of the ACC in that final 12-team playoff slate. And we have another special rule for the G5. If there is only one G5, if we vote off the only G5, we have to not only replace them, but we have to also go and look at the other 11 teams so we're not constantly picking on the G5 team. Although, to be fair, this season there's been very little movement. I mean, there was a hot minute when NIU made it in, but Boise State, it's been theirs to lose, and it continues to be. Although, maybe we'll talk about some of the challengers out there at some point in the week, if not later this episode. All of that said, so the teams we had heading into Week 11. Now, I'm going to use the last week's CFP rank as I go through these, because obviously there's been some losses, and the AP rank's a little different. Now, Oregon, of course, they are number 1 in all the rankings, although they squeaked by Wisconsin in the fourth quarter. They were behind, for the record, but we're probably not going to talk about voting them off. Ohio State had no problems beating Northwestern on Wrigley Field. There were some great shots of that particular game. Texas, we were a little worried about the Arkansas game. They went and they did take care of business on the road, 120-10 against Arkansas. Penn State had no trouble with hapless Purdue. Indiana decided to have their bye week right before they obviously have that big game at Ohio State this week. BYU, they lost to Kansas, who's apparently their whole mission right now is to ruin everyone else's season as they try to scrape together a bowl season. We'll see. We'll be getting back to them in a second. Tennessee also lost at Georgia pretty handily as the Bulldogs decided to kind of storm back. Notre Dame beat West Virginia. Alabama had no trouble with FCS Mercer in their SoCon rivalry game where they are undefeated. Although, hey, for credit, I should say present SoCon members. Alabama was a member of the Southern Conference a long time ago, but that was a different era. Georgia, as we mentioned, had no problem against Tennessee. Boise State, the final score is a little deceiving. 42-21 San Jose State. There was a moment there where the Broncos were sweating. And then finally, SMU took care of Boston College 38-28. So those were our 12 teams. 2 of them have lost. Let's talk about this group. What are your initial thoughts? I mean, we don't have to dive right into kicking one of these guys off, but what are your thoughts so far on how our teams did?
Yeah, so, obviously 2 teams lost, like you mentioned. BYU's perfect undefeated season came to an end, and amazingly, it happened because Kansas punted into a BYU player's head. So, and that is what decided the football game. So, college football, man, never change, never change. I think that Tennessee is also an interesting case because they're very likely to finish 10-2, but they kind of just have that Alabama win, which is a very good win, but then they lose by 2 touchdowns to Georgia. They lose earlier in the season to Arkansas. I don't know how the committee's going to look at them whenever this comes about. And we're going to learn more about this on Tuesday evening. If Tennessee is outside of the top 12 on Tuesday, I don't know the pathway for them getting back. I just don't think that they're going to have much opportunity to do so. But when you look down the board, I mean, look, it was a very competitive week, like you mentioned. And at this point of the season, you just got to survive. Like, you just got to survive. Like, I don't care that SMU was struggling late. I don't care that Texas only beat Arkansas on the road by 10. Like, I think at this point of the year, it's just wins and losses. And I will say, too, I think that that's actually a nice benefit of the 12-team playoff, is that like winning and just winning out, I think will be valued in a different kind of way than needing to sit here and be like, well, we need Penn State to pour it on, or we need, I think that sort of stuff is a little overvalued and historically has been much more important. I don't care as much that teams are playing closer games later in the year, as long as they win them.
Yeah, that was the BCS era where people would just beat the ever-living crap out of their conference opponents. Woe to the Rutgers and Temples of the world when Miami was trying to make a point that they should be included. That's all I got to say about that when they were in the Big East, for those of you youngins out there. But let's see here. It's good to also talk about some of the teams we don't have in our 12 and maybe people we'd be selecting from. Miami, we voted off last week after their loss to Georgia Tech. They had a bye this week, so they haven't really done anything. Although they're currently, they were dropped to number 9 in the CFP. Will probably stay maybe a little bit higher, a little lower. They'll probably stay in that general vicinity after a bye week. Ole Miss, they're now AP number 9. Again, they also had a bye week, so they didn't really get a chance to do anything to change opinions. Texas A&M, they had the safe 38-3 win over New Mexico State, which is hardly a challenger, but they're sitting there at number 15 across the board. Colorado, we're just going to bring them up as well, because especially if we remove BYU, presumably the only person to replace them with, because we'd have to replace them, they're the only Big 12 team with another Big 12 team, are the Buffaloes, which are certainly seeming to be rising. Now, the CFP has them at number 17. The AP, and again, remember, the new CFP comes out the day after we do this episode recorded. The AP has only moved them up to, I believe, number 18. So maybe they're being a little undervalued by the AP versus the CFP. But they had a very easy win on Utah, just on all sides of the ball. So they are the other team out there that we'll probably want to discuss. With just a quick shout out to the other two G5s out there. Obviously, Army had a bye week. They have a very big game this weekend, so we'll get a real chance to probably examine the cadets if they manage to top Notre Dame in Yankee Stadium. And then Tulane decided to remind everyone that they exist by shutting out Navy 35-0. That was something else. They have a bye week, I guess, until they play Memphis, but they have locked up a game against Army in the American. So the American Conference title game is the one game where both teams have been locked in. I mean, Oregon is locked in now to the Big Ten title game, but that's the only other one where we now have both teams, at least of concern for our eventual discussion on who's going to make the 12-team playoff. So those are some of the teams we have to pick from, some of which are kind of interesting that they're not in, but again, we've only got 12 spots. What do you think? Who should we cut?
So it has to be between BYU and Tennessee. And frankly, we could cut both. Like we have that ability as well. So here's what's interesting is that, of course, when we remove a team from the Big 12, we have to put in another team from the Big 12. So the conversation is not just, do we think we should remove BYU? It's also, do we think Colorado is a better choice at this point? Because whoever wins the Big 12, like the Big 12 is firmly a one bid league now. I think that the ACC also is probably firmly a one bid league at this point. So, and actually, I think that even when we have that conversation about putting back in Miami, like I think that we also need to think about it from that perspective. Do we think that Miami is a better option than SMU, who obviously did nothing to lose their spot this past week? I do feel like we should cut Tennessee. I think that they are going to be very borderline. And again, we'll learn more about the rankings this week, and that's going to shape it. But I just don't think that their resume is that good, because you're talking about a team that has a loss to Arkansas, which is as bad as any loss as any team on this list. You talk about a team that, yes, has beaten Alabama, but like Alabama's been really inconsistent over the past couple of weeks. And I think that you talk about a program that lost by 2 touchdowns to Georgia. So, like, I don't know. Like, they have the one data point, like one pretty good data point against Alabama, who's maybe like the 9th or 10th best team in the country. Is that enough to offset the fact that they only beat Oklahoma by 10? Is it enough to offset the fact that they've played other teams close that really they shouldn't have any business playing close? And more specifically, is that enough in an SEC where, I mean, I don't know, especially with Missouri losing, I would probably make the case that Tennessee is the lowest priority right now, or second right now. But the lowest priority of the SEC teams. Probably Texas A&M is behind them, but Texas A&M has the Texas game to play their way in. Tennessee has nothing more that they can do to add to their resume. So you're in a position where Alabama, Ole Miss, and Georgia, I think, are firmly ahead of them. I think that Texas, of course, as a one loss, is firmly ahead of them. I think that they're more likely to get jumped at this point than they are to jump somebody. So I would make the case, before we even get into the BYU conversation, I would make the case that Tennessee should be off our board.
Yeah, you bring up something interesting, because I mean, just as it's kind of a macro level, as we're getting later in the season, we really almost knowing that, as you said, I completely agree with the losses that have happened. The Big 12 and the ACC have kind of pushed themselves into one bid leagues. But anything involving the Big 12, we just have to ask which team seems to be the favorite. Same for the ACC. Yep. The SEC is a little more nuanced in the sense that, again, because of all these 8-team conference schedules with too many teams in the league, we're going to probably get a bevy of 2 losses. I mean, Georgia's done with their SEC schedule. They are officially 6-2, and then they're going to play, whoever UMass. We love you. Do go for it, Minutemen, with your interim head coach, and Georgia Tech. So those aren't going to change their SEC standings. And we're going to be faced with probably a bevy of 2-loss teams. So with Tennessee, we know Alabama's going to stay. They're currently in our Survivor Island. There's no reason they're going to move out of it. They're currently the AP number 7. Georgia, again, they just beat up Tennessee. We're also thinking about it this way. Teams that seem to be finishing the season strong. So Tennessee did have a good win over Alabama, but it was several weeks ago. And they played Kentucky, Mississippi State since. Are they ready to finish out the season and jump into what we're going to be discussing in the second half of the show, a playoff schedule? And are there teams that seem to be doing a little better at this point? Now, the question is, if we would be swapping them out, because again, if we're talking about bringing Miami back in, we'd be talking about SMU. We would not be talking about Tennessee. So with Tennessee, who would be the options to replace them? I agree, looking at some of the SEC teams, A&M, we'll talk about them at the end of the season. They've got to beat Texas, because I think whoever loses that game, including Texas, may find themselves in real trouble on whether or not they're going to be able to get into even an at-large spot in the playoff, just based on strength of schedule and how it's worked out with some of these teams, especially like Mizzou losing and LSU losing again. I think this question is, do we switch Tennessee with Ole Miss? Ole Miss is looking a little bit stronger again. They took a week off. They had that nice win against Georgia the previous week. They're going to be having a game. Let's see here. They're going to have at Florida, and of course the Egg Bowl, where anything goes. I think they'll have an opportunity there to perhaps to build themselves up. So I think I like Ole Miss a little bit more now than I did Tennessee, and I think it's really the product of the last 2 weeks, both of which involve.
Yeah, I think so too. We have such a close mutual performance between the two of them, where Ole Miss wins by 3 scores against Georgia, and then Tennessee goes and loses by 2 scores. Yeah, Ole Miss at home, of course, and Tennessee on the road. But that's a pretty damning mix. And by the way, Ole Miss's last game before that was beating Arkansas on the road by 32 points, who Tennessee also lost to. So I think at this point, there's not an awesome case for Tennessee to be ahead of Ole Miss. Now, look, I do think that one of these things, and this is part of the Georgia question too, long term, is like, how much do you value ceiling and how much do you value floor? Because Ole Miss also has probably the worst loss in the playoff race right now with their game against Kentucky, 20-17 at home, by the way. But clearly they've overcome that too. They have a 27-3 win over South Carolina that looks better and better. They have that 28-10 win over Georgia. I think that Tennessee just does not have the data points to play their way out of this, and I think Ole Miss has more.
I just have to say, within the SEC, because Notre Dame is just quietly whistling in a corner. Like,
that's true.
Like, yep, they have
I keep finding more and more. I keep finding more and more worse losses as we go along. the hole never stops getting deeper. Like you just look down and you're like, oh, well, I said, oh, Arkansas is a bad loss. Well, Kentucky's an even worse loss. Wait, well, Northern Illinois, and like that doesn't even get into like Colorado losing by 18 points against a Nebraska team that might not make a bowl. That doesn't count. I'm probably not as down on BYU losing to Kansas because like Kansas has decided to figure everything out in their second half of the season. But like they also lost to a Kansas team that has not been very good this year. They're 3-6, I think, or 4-6 now. So like, yeah, there's losses everywhere, man. There's so many bad losses.
So I think then safely we can probably swap out Tennessee for Ole Miss. I think Ole Miss right now has certainly put itself in a better position over the last 2 weeks. I really do like just juxtaposing their respective Georgia games and recent performance to say at this point, because again, Tennessee fans were just, again, they love their team, but they've even been like, wow, there's something wrong with our offense. And it really just didn't help them this time around. They've got a good defense. No one's doubting that. But still, Georgia had little trouble with them overall. And it's just not a team that we feel confident enough is going to be a survivor, particularly when we enter the 12-team playoff field. Now, a whole conversation in the latter half about our other contenders. But all right, Tennessee, we're going to swap you out this week with Ole Miss. Now, let's go back to our conversation about, we can just really lightly talk about this. Do we feel like there's any reason to swap SMU with Miami this week?
I don't. I just think that when you look at SMU and the way that they're playing right now, like they're really good. They're really, really good. Now, of course, they play a close game this past weekend against Boston College. They won by 10 points, but it was a little ugly at times. I think though that when you look at their kind of body of work at this point, of course, they have the big win over Louisville on the road. Their only loss was that 18-15 game against a BYU team that we still think is pretty good. The Pitt has fallen apart since the 48-25 loss to SMU, but like they beat them by that much, right? Like they beat TCU, who doesn't look bad, by 24 points. I think that their body of work right now is just a little different. And the other thing too that I'll say about SMU is that I actually think that their defense is kind of underrated. I think that that's a unit that has shown the ability to really muck up games. And I think that because of that, they're less reliant on their offense than Miami is at this point. It's going to be a great matchup whenever we get it, but I would continue to have SMU in the field. Let's kind of talk about an inverse of that too, though, which is BYU versus Colorado. Because Colorado is one of the hottest teams in college football right now after losing 2 games earlier in the season and nearly beating Kansas State in one of their games. But they are a team, and even like let's just specify in on like, I think we're very likely to get a BYU versus Colorado Big 12 title game where the winner goes to the college football playoff. I think that that's pretty likely to happen. And like I'll say, so last week heading in, I'm looking over at collegefootballinsiders.com, which is run by our buddy Stats Award, Parker Fleming. And last week, BYU would have been a 3-point favorite on a neutral field. This week, they're essentially tied. They're separated by 0.3 points. And Colorado has a 51% win probability versus BYU's 49%.
Wow.
So I think that this is a legitimate conversation. I think I narrowly lean BYU, but like, I mean, it's gonna be really interesting.
Well, let me point something out. this upcoming game for Colorado is Kansas. They're going to be playing again in Arrowhead because of all the construction in Lawrence. So I'm actually really curious to see how that crowd divides up. Are we going to see a lot of Buffalo fans suddenly show up for this game because it's in the giant, the Chiefs Stadium? That'll be an interesting way to kind of get a quick benchmark because, as we pointed out, the Jayhawks seem to have figured it out, and they could really just run the table and absolutely mess up the Big 12 just for the hell of it and go their way to the bowl, maybe even make a bowl. But all that said, that'll be an interesting way to compare them in a short order, kind of like what we just did with Tennessee, Ole Miss, and Georgia as kind of the middle ground. And a little bit on the ACC, I just want to say one awkward thing right now with Miami and SMU is they don't really have strong games to finish with. SMU goes to Virginia and hosts Cal in the finale. Miami hosts West Virginia and goes to Syracuse. We're pretty much going to expect both of those teams should win out. And so we're going to probably just get to see how they play against each other to eventually decide that one and settle it on its own. But yeah, for BYU, I don't know if there is a compelling reason yet to move them, but next week would be potentially convincing. And again, BYU, they go and they play Arizona State, which is going to be a huge game for the Sun Devils because they are also still in the Big 12 race. If they can beat BYU, suddenly they're also a contender, which is also just glorious. I love this season. This has been the best season for the Big 12. So I think for now we can hold only because, unlike the ACC, where it is just kind of a mediocre hold for the rest of the regular season, the next couple of weeks are actually going to be genuinely interesting in the Big 12, and we're going to get a chance to have a real good look at Colorado and potentially see if BYU can bounce back from that awkward loss, to the Jayhawks. So what are you thinking? We should keep SMU and BYU?
Yeah, I'm leaning that direction. If Colorado, well, actually, I don't even know if we'll need to pay attention. If BYU loses to Arizona State, this is going to be a really, really big game, then of course Colorado floats in. I think that whoever performs better this upcoming week between BYU on the road against Arizona State and Colorado playing versus Kansas, also on the road, I think that whoever performs better will be in our field next week. But I don't think that I'm quite ready to make that decision now.
I've had some Kansas fans predict that they're going to go beat Colorado and then lose on a walk-off field goal to Baylor. That has been the prediction. Because Baylor's also in this race.
For people who don't know about the insanity that's been this Kansas season, so they lost a lot of games early in the year. They actually started 1-5, with their losses being by 6 to Illinois, by 3 to UNLV, by 4 on the road against West Virginia, by 11 to TCU, by 4 to Arizona State. So just insanely close games that were largely decided because Jalen Daniels, your quarterback, had interception issues. Since then, crushed Houston, played Kansas State within 2 points, really could have had that game, and then beat number 17 Iowa State, number 6 BYU in a row, and now have a chance to go play number 17 Colorado. So they have to win all of the rest of their games to make a bowl game, but they've already done the hardest parts. So yes, them losing on the road against Baylor on a walk-off would be the fittingest way for them to miss a bowl game after all of this just ridiculousness.
Because, again, and the idea of Baylor making it in and winning the Big 12 championship, I don't know if they would get it would depend how the G5.
Oh, no, they would not. They would have no chance. In fact, I think even if Arizona State were to be the team that wins the Big 12, I think they get in. But first of all, they have zero shot at a bye. Boise State clearly gets a bye over them. The other thing too is that if you are a Big 12 fan, you have got to, especially if you're an Arizona State fan, you have to be really, really rooting for Army to lose to Notre Dame this week. Because if Army beats Notre Dame, then suddenly they move into the top 12-ish. They'll play a Tulane team that'll have the opportunity to beat them. And then you are in very, very precarious position of 2 group of 5 teams as conference champions finishing ahead of your champion. So the first ever college football playoff was built around the Big 12 having the first team out, and they're getting awfully, awfully close to making that happen again in the 12-team playoff.
They make it interesting. They make it fun. That is Big 12 football. All right, so I think I agree with you. Let's go ahead and keep BYU. and SMU in our group as the Big 12 and ACC representatives. And then we'll see how this week pans out, and we'll see what other surprises happen. Well, when we get back from this break, we will talk about of these teams and maybe even some of the outsiders. But really, I mean, at this point, we may not have to go beyond our 12 teams. Who actually seems to have a genuine chance of winning the national championship, and what does that even mean in the 12-team era? Here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right, so we have 12 teams. Now, as I said, we're kind of nitpicking between ACC, Big 12, and two-loss SEC teams. But really, when it comes down to it, this is the 12-team playoff era. There's going to be more than just 2 games to get in. It isn't just, obviously, a semifinal and the national championship. It is going to have a first round. We're going to have some quarterfinals, semifinals, national championship. There is a road there that needs to be taken. And the question is, which team, what should we even look for in a team that could make it through? How would you set that stage for someone who isn't necessarily, who's still stuck in that mentality of the 14 playoff era?
Well, I think what people need to understand is that it's about to become a whole lot harder to make it all the way to the national title game. In a 4-team field, you just have to win one, and then you're playing for a national title. So in some ways, it actually gave the really good teams a mulligan in some ways in order to set them up. That's not going to be the case in the 12 team for a couple of reasons. One, if you are not a team that gets a first round bye, which only 2 teams, by the way, from the Big 10 and SEC are going to be able to get those buys. The other 2 will go to ACC, Big 12, Group of 5, 2 of the 3 of those. So if that happens, like, you will have to play 4 games to win a national championship. And so I think about a team like Georgia right now, or a team like Alabama, who clearly talent-wise is good enough to win in the national championship. Well, like, can they put together 4 games in a row? I think that that's going to be the big question, because they haven't during the regular season, and most teams don't, frankly. Like in college football, most teams don't put together 4 good performances in a row, and you're going to have to do it against 4 good opponents in a row as well. So like I think about, like, let's just think about the 5 seed right now, right? So like the 5 seed in this scenario will have to play the 12 seed, which let's just say right now is Boise State. And Boise State nearly upset Oregon in week 2. They have the best player in the college football playoff in Ashton Jeanty, unless Travis Hunter makes it, then we can have a conversation about that. But right now, the best player overall in the field. And if you win that game, which, okay, let's say that you should, you go play number 1 in your you play number 4 actually in your second game, and then you play number 1. Those are your first 3 games. So it's 3 really good teams in a row that you have to beat one after the other. And that guarantees you a date with number 1 in the semifinals. And so it's going to be complicated. It's going to be difficult for any team. So I think that another piece of this is going to be depth is going to be more important than ever. This is something that actually benefits a team like Georgia in some ways. Because, again, if you're playing 4 games week after week after week, like, you're going to be down starters by the time that you're making it to the semifinals and national championship game. You just are. And so the teams that have the most workable depth are going to be at an advantage. The teams that are deepest in the trenches, especially. I mean, we've seen with both Ohio State and Georgia this year, they've had offensive line injuries that have ruined games for them at times, right? You look at that game between Georgia and Ole Miss. That was an injury game for the offensive line. They get Tate Ratledge back this last week against Tennessee, and they play a lot better. Well, if Ratledge is hurt, right, heading into one of these second or third games, that's a big deal. So I think that those are some of the dynamics that are going to be a little different, is like, you just have to have the roster, the potential, the luck is another big piece of this too, to win 4 games in a row to win a national championship. It's going to be a very different dynamic.
Yeah, one thing I want to ask about, especially with depth, because again, we've already talked about how with some of the, especially the big teams that we've talked about, the ones that were dominating, especially in the middle of the 14 playoff era, and it was getting a little bit dry, that really only several teams ever seemed to ever have a shot at making it all the way through. culminating with that Alabama-Clemson series of games. But with the NIL and the transfer portal, we've seen, more backups leaving, and even some that might have been ready to start even when they were a backup just because of the logjam of talent. I'm wondering how much influence that's going to have as we head into these games. But also, I just want to put a note out there. Do we think the transfer portal is going to have any effect? Because, the transfer portal opens on December 9th and goes all the way until the 28th. Now, if you're a backup of one of these teams that you're like, all right, I don't know if I'm ever going to get a chance. What if things actually do happen and you lose someone to the portal right before? Are we going to see, are we going to see some key? Imagine if you're a key backup and your team has 4 games they have to go through. Could you start saying, I don't know if I want to stick around. My NIL ain't that great. Could you see a little bit of that? Oh my God. The drama there could be fantastic.
Yeah. So the answer to almost all these questions is yes. I don't think that we are going to see starters leave. I don't think we're going to see like draft guys sit out. I don't think we're going to see that. But I do think that we will be in a position where key backups are potentially looking at their options. I think that we could see situations where key backups are going to the coaching staff and being like, hey, yeah, if you want me to stay and play in this playoff, like I need a pay bump. I need more investment. And I think the other piece is, I think that when you are in this situation, right, as a team, like it's going to be huge to see just how teams handle it. And one of the ways, like I think back to last year, Malik Murphy, the backup quarterback at Texas, did enter the transfer portal as a key backup in like that would have played in the college football playoff. Now, I think that situation's a little unique because Texas was kind of ready to move on to their other backup quarterback, Arch Manning. But like, if Quinn gets hurt and you're having to throw out a true freshman to be a backup in the college football playoff, that would be a big deal. I actually think that quarterback might be one of the most interesting of these deals because like a lot of these teams, by the way, do not have great quarterback depth. Like I'm thinking about Georgia, right? Brock Vandagriff transfers last year. They brought in Jaden Rashada to kind of develop as their backup quarterback. We don't really know if he's ready at this point. Obviously, he had some issues last year. He dealt with injuries last year, so Gunnar Stockton might be the guy. But what if Gunnar Stockton transfers after this? Like, you just have no idea how some of these key position groups might be impacted, especially, again, when you have players who know that they aren't in the plans for the 2025 season.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see how some of that might play out. And frankly, we may not even hear a lot of this stuff getting into like the percolating to the public level. It only does when there's a complete fiasco like what happened at UNLV earlier this season. And for the Rebels, it actually didn't seem to hurt them at all. But, I'm fascinated to see that and how that works out. Now, looking ahead, by the way, just for those curious, and I always take these with a huge grain of salt because using the current AP rankings, like the most recent rankings we have, they're like the PSAT to the SAT, that is the CFB score, so to speak. But right now, it looks like the top 4 conference champions there because, again, going at the highest ranked Big 12 is BYU still. That puts them at the 12 seed. So we're going to have right now Oregon number 1, Texas number 2, Miami number 3, and Boise State is number 4 seed. That sounds so crazy now. So much crazy. Not the BYU part. The Miami part sounds crazy, but folks are going to have to get ready for the seeding. We've talked about this. Ohio State would have number 5 squaring off in the first round, hosting 12 seed BYU. 6 seed Penn State would be hosting 11 seed Ole Miss. 7 seed Indiana would be hosting 10th seed Georgia, and 8 seed Notre Dame will be hosting Alabama. Now, it has been pointed out the southernmost game in this group in the first round is Bloomington, Illinois. So
Indiana, Bloomington,
Indiana. Sorry, I always say it, but that is going to be. Woo, yes. I won't end up this way, but I still chuckle that a couple of these are SEC teams heading up to play in the cold.
So I think one other dynamic too that's going to be interesting before we talk about the northern weather thing, which I think will be also fascinating, is I mean I'm curious too. So let's take BYU and Indiana just as an example, right? These are two teams that one like don't really have backups who everybody's clamoring for, not because they're not good, but just because like they're not as known as like Alabama's 5-star backup safety, right? Like it's just a different dynamic. And two, like if you are the 7 seed and you're Indiana, like this is the greatest thing that's ever happened in your life, right? Like this is like the coolest thing of all time. Everybody on campus, everybody on the roster is like, whatever we need, man, like we're gonna make it happen. Actually, I think that Boise State might be an even better example of this, right? Where like you have a player like Ashton Ginty, who obviously would play in the college football playoff and play well. Like, how is a key contributor going to transfer from Boise State if they can be a part of the first ever college football playoff team? They're just not going to do it, right? Like they're going to be there. Whereas like if you're at Alabama and you're the 10 seed and you're like, can we even win the national title? Is this really worth my, and like it definitely isn't like there isn't going to be opt-outs from the perspective of like Jalen Milroe being like, no, thank you. But like, I think that if you are a team that is maybe loving the idea of just being in the field a little bit more than being, the third string linebacker at Georgia, I mean, I do feel like that kind of will be a minor advantage, at least for a team that really has a locked in roster where people aren't going to leave.
It is interesting. I wonder if this season we'll see most people stay because it's the excitement. Everyone thinks they're going to win. But if, as the 12-team playoff continues year after year, if we start to see a pattern and you're on that team that's probably not going to make it, you're just lucky to get in. And you're a team that's normally excellent, like one of the SEC teams that's just not having a tip-top year, but makes it in, like in Alabama or Georgia this season, for example. I wonder if we'd see that more, for certain, especially once that transfer window opens. Thankfully, they can't go and immediately play at other teams because then that would get really funny to see like Boise State like, hey, we kind of had some injuries. We know you're the third stringer on that SEC team, but we need a first stringer now. That would get chaos. I would just love to see people lose their minds in the college football fandom because that would generate articles and fan posts that I couldn't even fathom right now.
Well, I think the funnier thing, again, this is not happening. This will probably never. No, it will never happen. It will never happen. Is the idea of like Boise State being like, guys, wasn't that awesome? Anyway, hey, Ricky White, don't you want to be part of the Mountain West All-Star team? Like, don't you want to be a part of the college football playoff? Like, we could use some receiver help. Like, we got one or two good receivers, but we could definitely use another. Like like imagine a world where like people could just like go out and just be like, hey, good teams with players who didn't make hey, Travis Hunter, obviously you played at Colorado this year, but like we could use some corner help here at Oregon or whatever, and like you can be part. Again, it will never happen. I just want to be clear about that.
Shedeur Sanders, that would make it even more spicy.
The real spicy would be in that scenario the idea of being like, hey, Shedeur Sanders, we don't think Dylan Gabriel's all that good, so we're gonna actually jettison it from the but again, this will not happen. I do think it will be fascinating though, also the idea of going on the road to cold environments, because look, I think it's a little overrated, but it's not but it's not like crazy either. Like it really is a big deal to play in a completely new environment.
I have to say, like, the extreme example is Hawaii's horrible luck every time they go and play somewhere snow. They were favored against Utah State, and Utah State obliterated them at home in the snow.
Yeah. No, it's a big difference. And like, I think that again, like you think of a place like Indiana, you think of like, there are going to be examples of this where it just like sucks to play. One that kind of like for me as a Big 12 guy always comes to mind is like Texas teams pray that they do not get West Virginia in November on the road. Like, just because it's like, it's just not what you're built to do. It's not what you're used to. And I think that another piece too is like, I'm trying to think what was the game last week where, I I think it was Ohio. No, not Ohio State. There was a game last week where somebody grew out the grass, and like
Oh,
it's.
yes. Oh,
I'm
I
trying to
forgot.
remember which.
Did Wisconsin grow out the grass for
I think it might
Oregon?
have
I
been.
can't remember. Yeah.
That's it. That's it. Yeah, it was Oregon versus Wisconsin, and like yeah, like there are teams that are built for certain climates, for certain stadiums. Again, there's a reason that like Big Ten teams are much more physical than they are speed based, is because you don't cut the same way when it's 15 degrees outside, right? It hits your body differently. And so the way that you maximize your climate is through strength and physicality. Whereas like there's a reason that all of the best track stars in the America are in the South. It's because you can run all year long. Like you can't go running outside. I mean, you showed us on Halloween it was snowing in Minneapolis. It's not like that down here. So like you can go outside right now on November 18th, and honestly, the big issue is that it's going to be too hot outside to run still.
Yeah, one thing is for sure, even though this 12-team bracket we named using the AP poll is certainly not going to be the final one, I can say, I think we can all say with certainty at least one cold weather host will happen because
At least.
or it's either going to be Ohio State and or Penn State because
Yeah.
both of them will probably end up in those top spots. Oregon, if they lose, will still potentially be cold. It won't snow, but it's not exactly like Eugene.
It's not quite the same. It's not quite the same.
It could be a warm weather.
It's not Midwestern cold.
No,
it's not Midwestern
but
colds.
it could be a wet, soggy mess. So all that said, now let's take a look at the teams that are up for it right now. Who do you think is true? We've talked about what it takes to win. Whom among these teams do we think are built for it? I mean, Oregon probably seems the best bet, but are they? Is it really Ohio State that has the depth that we've been talking about all year round?
I go back and forth so much on Oregon, man. Like I know that they beat Ohio State. I know that they're playing at such a high level right now. I don't know what it is. I just can't get all the way there with them. I think that Ohio State, from a roster perspective, is still the best roster in America. I think that when I think that they have both the highest ceiling in the country and the highest floor in the country. That's what I love about them so much. I look at a team because to talk about some others, right? Georgia and Alabama, their ceilings are as high as anybody, arguably maybe slightly higher. But like their floor has been so much lower this year. Ohio State doesn't really have bad games, doesn't have low floor games. Part of it is schedule, certainly, but like I don't know what the world looks like. Like, when's the last time that Ohio State lost a game by 18 points against anybody? Right?
Yeah.
Like, it just doesn't happen. They're always in games, partially because their defense is really good, but obviously because of what they do offensively. I think that they have explosion that you really need. And it's not just from one guy, right? Like they have two running backs in Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, who both have breakaway ability. Jeremiah Smith is the most talented receiver in the country. I don't think he's quite yet the best receiver in the country, but he's the most talented. And if he's not playing well, you got Carnell Tate and Emeka Egbuka, who are up there with the most talented receivers in the entire country. So like, I just think that they have more pathways to winning than anybody. They should have won that Oregon game. Like if they don't get called for offensive pass interference in that game, and or if Will Howard reads the clock correctly, then they kick a game-winning field goal and win against the team that's now number one in the country.
It has to be said too. They've played two number 3 teams on the road and gone 1-1, and their loss was extremely close to one, obviously, against Oregon.
Yes.
So their resume also is just so impressive. And that's part of the problem with Oregon. Oregon got stuck like a couple of teams where that Illinois game seemed like it was a little bit better than it was at the time. But outside of that, the schedule just wasn't that great. And now I have the weird feeling of that Wisconsin game. I don't care what, just something went wrong there. Now, again, you have to just win out, and we've seen plenty of teams that have ended up being the killers, have some weird hiccup towards the end of the season, but that was still a little too much of what got us worried at the beginning of the season.
Yeah.
So
I think, let me ask this question of you. Do you think, so I'm going to put Ohio State 1, Oregon 2. Do you think that any SEC team, or Notre Dame, or anybody else, do you think that anybody else is ahead of these two teams, or are these the clear top two to win a national championship.
I do feel Ohio State has put itself ahead of Oregon just overall. I think depth-wise, especially because, and maybe perhaps I should say, part of what went into that Wisconsin game was they were down a couple of key players. So that also shows Oregon is still, when they don't have everyone, they may not be operating on all of the cylinders that we saw in some of their best games. I do wonder, especially as the season has gone on and how they've responded to a pair of one weird loss and one, difficult loss on the road. I do wonder how Alabama would stack up. Just because I know they lost a lot of people, in fact, some of them to Ohio State, but that's why they're number one in our list.
Yes.
But I do wonder if Alabama could maybe hang with them more so than Georgia right now, but only because Jalen Milroe's coming on. But I'm not sure. I think at this point, I want to give Oregon that edge just because, it's still hard to win all the games, and they're winning all their games, including against whatever opponents in front of them. Two of which are, of course, Boise State is still in this discussion. I mean, two of which that are still part of the playoff discussion. So I think, they've beat two teams that are at this point, I wouldn't say locks, but almost certainly going to be in the playoff regardless.
So I will point out, again, to go back to College Football Insiders, Alabama ranks number one in EPA margin. They would be favored right now per this system by 1.6 points against Oregon. So, I mean, there is a discussion there. I think for me, it's tough to fully embrace the Alabama case because of how inconsistent they've been. Because, again, they've had the highs. They've also had a couple of real lows. And look, I mean, I don't think that you look at either of their losses and think that they're very good. And now you're going to have to potentially play 4 games in a row. That's my big question with them. Whereas, the winner of Ohio State, Oregon is only going to have to play 3 games. Alabama's going to have to play 4 in a row because they have really very little pathway to being, well, I mean, it's not impossible, but they're probably not going to be the SEC champion is what it looks like right now. I also want to draw our attention for a second to Texas because Texas has what I love, which is the high floor, right? They don't mess up very often, but they've played one good team. And they lost at home in a game that wasn't even as close as 30-15. And if they lose on the road against Texas A&M, which that's going to be a great game, I'm excited to go to that one. I don't think they should be in the field, because they wouldn't have. I'm trying to look they wouldn't have a single ranked victory at that point. They'd be 0-2 against ranked teams, one being a 15-point loss at home. But I'm also curious
let me add to
too.
that. It should be an elimination game for those two teams because A&M had 2 ranked wins, but they are two teams that are no longer ranked, Mizzou and LSU. Yeah. So, I mean, it's going to go these 2 teams. I mean, neither of them are going to play a game in next week that is going to have this weekend that's going to have any relevance. I mean, Florida and Auburn, respectively, cool, but neither of them are going to move the needle. We're going to have a team. It's going to be their only opportunity to beat a ranked opponent that's currently ranked is going to be that Texas A&M game.
Yeah, it's a strange situation. I think Texas, Kentucky, not Florida, but yeah, it's going to be it'll be a huge game. Now, I think again with Texas, you just feel like there's the gear there on offense somewhere. You feel like there's just the thing wherever. But how many games are we going to give them to try to find it? In their last couple of games, Florida they played pretty well, but Florida was without everybody, essentially. So you scored 20 against Arkansas, you scored 27 against Vanderbilt, you scored 15 against Georgia. The final score of the Oklahoma game was 34-3, but that was a defensive game where just Texas had the ball the entire game. I don't know which game since the Michigan game you're looking at and saying, wow, this is one of the best offenses in college football. It just hasn't been, especially over the past couple of weeks. Again, if they drop 40 to 50 points on Texas A&M, who has a pretty good defense, then hopefully I'll feel a little better about that. But I'm worried about them. I don't know if this team is capable of winning the national title. And the other piece of it too is I don't think they can run the ball at a title level. And we knew that this was potentially an issue coming into the year. but like it's reared its head, right? Like they have tried to use the screen game to try to make up for not having a true running game, and Quintravion Wisner has played pretty well overall, especially since taking over more of the running back one snaps. But like it's also, I think, some blocking issues too. Like, yes, they don't have necessarily the guy that they need at running back right now, but like I don't think that they've run block all that well against good teams either. So I don't know if I see Texas right now as a team that can win the national championship. I'd have them a little bit more towards the middle of the pack.
What do you make of, and this is both of these teams kind of come to mind, but let's start with Notre Dame because I think they've been sort of quietly present in all of this. Do we think, how do we even, I mean, at this point, again, they have a pair of good teams to finish their season. They obviously play the big Army game and then they go to USC, which while USC isn't ranked, it's going to be an interesting game nonetheless because USC is just this weird team that seems to have the ability to put the other team to the test. Do we think they have enough to make it through?
Yeah, it's so interesting because this is a team that lost multiple offensive linemen for the year, lost their two best defensive linemen. It hasn't hurt them to this point. Maybe it won't hurt them. Like their offensive line is playing really well right now with the guys that they have. And again, this is a program that develops them and puts them out as well as anybody. So the fact that they've survived to this point, outside of that one little hiccup early in the year, I think speaks well to them. It's tough for me though. Like I feel like I try to be very particular about not importing previous thoughts about a team into a season. But this is a team that I've really struggled to see reach their ceiling on the offensive side of the ball. Now, I actually do think that Riley Leonard for them is the kind of quarterback that they probably need. And he has not been very consistent throwing the ball. Like he's all right, but he just gives you a lot of playmaking with his legs that changes the way that you're able to play offense for this team, right? This year he has 641 yards and 13 touchdowns on the ground compared to only 12 touchdowns to the air, by the way. So like maybe just that little bit of playmaking in a year where, I mean, you look at the teams that we have in the field right now, like this is not an awesome quarterback year, right? Like this is a year where I think that having a legit playmaker at quarterback, like it's kept Alabama in games. Certainly, I think that you could make the case that it's kept, I mean, again, in a different type of playmaker way, like BYU is where it is because they've gotten playmaking at the quarterback position. SMU certainly since they switched to Kevin Jennings. Curtis Rourke obviously is one that I must mention, but like maybe that's enough to get over all of it. I also just don't know if this Notre Dame defense is quite as good as it's been in years past. It's still good, but I don't think that it's like the elite top 5 type defense that we've seen. So they have played outside of that one game really well. But I don't know. Do you think that they're a title contender?
Well, part of the problem is they're in the same boat, ironically, as the team they opened the season with, Texas A&M, and also, by extension, Texas. The ranked games they played ended up not being against particularly great teams. Louisville's been inconsistent, to put it mildly. Navy just completely fell off the map after that game. They apparently greeted Navy's decline. And then the rest of the lineup, I mean, Purdue, Miami of Ohio, Stanford, Florida State. Like, who are we even, like, Georgia Tech may be the best opponent they had. And even then, I'm not even sure about that. So that's a problem. I mean, they're hard to get a read of, but you see them rising in the rankings, but at the same time, I don't know. They're similar to Texas in that I just don't know. And at least you could say Texas lost to Georgia, while Northern Illinois ain't quite it. The other team that I also wanted to put in there, and of course we're going to get a real quick test of them very soon, Indiana. Do we think they're built for anything, or are they just more of a curiosity?
We're going to figure out this week. We're 100% going to figure out this week.
Maybe they could beat Ohio State, or maybe they lose, whichever. Maybe it's a close game, and we're going to be like, oh, man, I'd love to see that game again if it's not in Columbus. Do we think Indiana's built to, though, go through a 4-game playoff? Pardon me.
So certainly the depth piece is going to be tough, right? Like that's going to be the biggest disadvantage for the non-superpower teams. But let's go to the ratings for a second. Indiana has a 40% win probability heading into this game against Ohio State on the road. And That's pretty damn good. They're number 8 nationally in EPA margin. They rank number 2, I believe, in total defense. If you look by EPA, they're number 3 in offense. Like, this is real. Like whatever happens this week, like, this is not a fluke. They've played enough games to this point against pretty good opponents to feel like this isn't just a fluke. I just don't know their ceiling right now. Like, I don't. That's the big issue, big question with them, is that we have no idea what their ceiling is in 2024 because they haven't gotten to play a ceiling type program. And so, I mean, look, and I don't think they have to beat Ohio State to feel like they can win the national title, but they have to compete with them. They have to look really good against them. And if they lose a game like the way that Ohio State lost to Oregon, nobody will care. Like, that's fine. Like, then you just waltz into the playoff at 11-1 and you feel good about it. But I mean, that's also like, what if, I mean, I think right now the line is up to 12 points. What if they lose by 2 touchdowns? What if they lose by 3 touchdowns? So it makes it really hard for me to kind of rate them. But, like, you know, what you do against lesser to middling competition and the consistency that you play at does say something about your team and does say something about your program. The fact that they were still able to keep things going for the most part when their best player, Curtis Rourke, was hurt, I think that says something. They've got a good backup in Taven Jackson at quarterback. So I think that you at least have to consider the possibility that they can win the title. But I mean, if we're rating them against this group, right? So, like, you know, not that we have to go full ranking or anything. To me, I would put Ohio State, Oregon as the top 2. I would put Georgia, Alabama maybe next. And I think that then, well, actually, let me ask you this. Who do you feel more confident as a title contender? Indiana or Penn State?
I would put Indiana only because I feel Penn State somehow gets it in its own mind. I think they get in their own head.
Yeah.
That's the only reason why. Maybe it needs just fresh eyes. Which, by the way, if somehow Indiana does make it all the way through and Penn State loses in the first round, I can't even fathom what that's going to be like.
They will pay Kurt Signetti $20 million a year and pay $60 million to get rid of James Franklin if that happens.
My goodness.
No, I mean, I do think that this is like, just to touch on something else real quick. This is a really interesting question too, which is Penn State and James Franklin and Ole Miss and Lane Kiffin. You know, I've kind of used these as the poster children for like the tier 2 programs, the ones that are really good, but maybe not title good. They've kind of been able to exist and feel all right about themselves for a long time. But, like, this is going to maximize the divide between programs when it happens, right? Like, we're going to end up in positions where, like, it is going to be painfully obvious, oh, you're not like that, right? It's not just the fact that Penn State is in the Big Ten and Big Ten East with Michigan and Ohio State. It's actually just that they cannot hang. And I certainly don't think that it would happen this year, but, like, let's just say the next 2 or 3 years, Penn State's a top 10 team, but they lose in the first round every single year. I think that's going to cause some movement. I think that's going to cause some angst and anxiety, and it'll be a really interesting dynamic to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll go ahead and I think wrap this one up. We've had a long conversation about this topic, and let's say we've gone for about an hour or so with breaks we've taken in the middle of this. Just want to take a second to thank all of you for listening and thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan J. Raja. You can find his work at cbssports.com and at Shehan J. Raja on X and TikTok. And Blue Sky, I'm Bobak Ayeri, a part of the group that runs Reddit CFB. Thanks for joining, everyone.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.